Good Sunday afternoon, beautiful people. This is another episode of Kiko's Freethinkers Forum, episode 74. Yes, you heard that correctly, episode 74. And we're joined by a very special guest. Her name is Radhika Desai, and she is part of the political science department at the University of Manitoba. She also published an interesting book that I finished up reading last week that we're going to talk about today, which is going to be the crux of our discussion. That's entitled Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, a Geopolitical Economy. She's the author of several books previous to that, also including Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire. And she also convenes the International Manifesto Group, and she's a director at the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the aforementioned University of Manitoba in Canada. We want to say, Dr. Desai, welcome to the show for the first time, and we appreciate you accepting the invitation.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Kiko. I look forward to the conversation very much.
Absolutely. We had some previous guests on, and I was telling Radhika off the air how this conversation just stirred up so many thoughts in my mind. And I know the audience is probably going to be curious after the interview too, because we will talk about some theory, economic theory, but we're going to try to present it in a way to where people can understand. And that's good because honestly, I'm not an economist. And so I'm going to play kind of devil's advocate, like I don't know what's going on with the audience. And so we can all learn together. That's kind of the point of the forum, is to connect to people who normally wouldn't have access to this information, or at least have it explained the way a lot of people could interpret to their understanding. But I want to give a small advertisement before we begin and say thank you to everyone that follows the forum. Please support independent media, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Subscribe for free to Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. I'm not asking you for any of your money. I just want a little bit of your time to expand your mind. And that's all I'm looking for. And where can you find that this day without people trying to get money from you? I just want to converse with people, communicate with people. We've reached 93 different countries. And so that's a testament to where a small platform like this can grow if we really start to talk to people one by one. And that's always been the purpose of the forum, is to make it an international community. And hopefully we're accomplishing that, and we continue to grow. So I appreciate everything, and all the guests and the audience participation is greatly appreciated. I wanted to open the conversation to Dr. Desai, and just, again, what we're going to talk about is around the book. Pretty much everything we talk about will be relevant to the book, and that's what makes it so interesting. But I want to clear up this idea of what the Western left is. A question I asked Carlos Garrido when he came on, I think it was Labor Day he came on. What exactly is the Western left? And the argument that you make in the book talks about capitalism, but there seems to be a distinction between the US, UK capitalism that we're accustomed to, and maybe the capitalism that's used in Japan, South Korea, for instance, continental Europe. What are those variances? But before we even get to that question, what is the Western left? What does that look like?
Well, when I use the term the Western left, I'm basically referring to the left in the major Western countries. So that means North America, that is to say the US and Canada, Western Europe, particularly because, of course, Eastern Europe is a different category, and then Japan as well, where you find essentially a certain, shall we say, inability to understand and appreciate what imperialism is. And this inability to understand and appreciate, I trace to two quite different issues. One is certain compromises that already were being made among Western Marxists. And here again, now I'm using the term Western Marxists roughly in the sense that Perry Anderson used it in his book, what was it called? Considerations on Western Marxism, a slim little volume of some lectures that he gave in which he delineated the contours of Western Marxism, which was basically Western European Marxism, and then perhaps US Canadian as well. Although I would say that similar problems, at least to the extent that I know about it, are also found in Japan. Now, so the first is certain intellectual compromises that were made, which we can talk about, but essentially they portrayed Marx's analysis of capitalism, which was fundamentally about capitalism's contradictions and the fact that capitalism was a form of social production that was aimed at producing value, this intangible thing, but nevertheless very real thing. So instead of understanding capitalism as contradictory value production, the understanding of capitalism tended to get merged into a neoclassical economics, where it was neither contradictory and where the value aspects were sort of essentially erased, partly by saying that Marx's views suffered from a transformation problem where he could not transform values into prices, blah, blah, etc. So that is the first, that is an intellectual limitation. And then, of course, the second limitation is very real historical, in the sense that when we talk about the Western left, we are talking about the left in the historic imperialist countries. And therefore also, and there also we have a record of how, historians have shown how, going back to the heyday of the Second International, there were important currents within the Second International which essentially compromised with imperialism. And then this compromise has only become ever sharper, ever more prominent up to the present time, when, you have, particularly with the shift of social democratic parties, which had already become social democratic rather than Marxist, but the shift of social democratic parties further to the right under leaders like Tony Blair and Bill Clinton and what have you, Schroeder and so on. So this shift has it is based on a tendency that was already rooted within the left, which was again this inability to deal with imperialism. And that's why much of what I've done is I've tried to show that Marxist thinking was not like this, and that the Western left is mistaken to think what it does. So I hope that gives you a good idea of what I consider the Western left to be.
No, it does. I like and that makes sense, because there seems to be a conscience that's rooted in the geopolitical, and not so much this, what I call almost a localized tribalism in the United States, especially because that's where I'm at right now in Tennessee, out of all places. And I think that's something that kind of made me reflect on reading your book is I don't really talk about it. I seem to be going away from that label more and more, this whole idea of the left, because I just believe it changes depending on where you are, because the left of someone in Tennessee is going to look different than someone maybe in another location. But you do see these contradictions, because I don't think that the left takes into consideration the intersectional elements. Like, how does class and race and all these things play into the thinking? I think that almost a presumption that everyone kind of has that base. But when I talk to people who call themselves the left, they couldn't be any different. It's like they almost discard some of the class elements that I think that are essential in analysis, or they may just not talk about this group, indigenous people. They may not care about their interest or anything. So it's hard to sort of balance all those things together into one, the economics, the social. I think that's a big problem I see.
Well, I mean, I think you have a very serious point there. So, this inability to see imperialism is, I would say, from my point of view, the biggest and perhaps the biggest reality of it. And as I say, as you rightly said, it has objective elements and subjective elements or aspects. But then also what you are particularly pointing to, I think you make a couple of points. Number one, the left is always, I mean, in any given locality, in any given city, it can take different forms, and it can be quite different from these general understandings that we are creating. So no doubt about that. And indeed, if, to the extent that certain local lefts may deviate from the description I'm giving right now, that is where change is going to come from, because this situation has to change. The left cannot remain blind to imperialism. So that's the second point I wanted to make. And the third point I want to make is that, you see, when we say Western left, of course, some people will use the term left to specifically exclude, say, the Democratic Party, for example, or the Labour Party in the UK. They are not really left. They have already sold out, etc. But if you think of it objectively, I mean, all these different parts of the left do affect one another. They are knocking around and they influence one another. So I would also say that what has also happened in the Western left is, on the one hand, there is a sort of insistence that only class matters and nations don't matter, which is manifestly false. And at this point in time in particular, I think it does a lot of disservice to an understanding how the world is changing and how we may help it to change in progressive directions. But also the other thing that has happened is that as a result of the shift of the social democratic parties further to the right under the likes of Blair and Clinton, these parties have essentially ended up embracing forms of neoliberalism and then combining that with what I call tokenistic forms of social liberalism. So, they say that they care about feminism or anti-racism, etc. But in reality, their solution to the problems of women or non-white people or what have you is simply to put a small number of often quite intellectually and politically compromised women and non-white people in positions of power. I mean, do you think that American women are better off because Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State or what have you? I mean, this is ridiculous, right? But that is what we are supposed to swallow. So this kind of tokenism then stands in for, a real action, which would directly look at the class elements of women's oppression, of Black people's oppression, all of these different things, but these generally don't get much attention. But nevertheless, our social liberalism is then used as a stick with which to beat other countries, groups, etc., etc. So this creates all sorts of, and it creates the terrain for the culture wars that now dominate politics and which completely displace the discussion of class and international oppression, that is to say class oppression and exploitation, and international oppression and exploitation, that is to say the workings of imperialism.
No doubt. I think that's the purpose of the culture wars, because these groups, and I don't even want to say there's just two sides. I think that there's so much going on even within the same supposed side, because there's this propensity to try to distinguish how different they are from one another. But in reality, if you do factor in the class dynamic, I think that the mirror starts to show, oh gosh, are we that different? Besides a couple of coffee discussions about gender or whatever, I think it makes people have to question their whole political economy. And I think that's why it's easier to just resort to pointing out these superficial differences at times, as opposed to attacking the real issue, which is the class struggle. And honestly, the forum, the only interest here really, that is the interest here, is the class struggle. Now, we do talk about identity, politics, but not within the context of the culture war. We talk about identities in the sense of searching for where is the value in identities. Like, I think that's important. We don't want to degrade identities, but just to use identities just for the tokenism aspect that you mentioned, which is obviously the situation we have here. Somehow Barack Obama represented most Black people, which is the most ridiculous claim ever, or any of these things. I mean, it's just ridiculous how even the celebrity somehow trickles down, and that becomes a part of the collective Blacks or the collective whatever marginalized group it is. And that just seems to be to the extent of discussion that we have. And we have to find ways to get away from that. Yes. But you mentioned the second chapter was, wow, I had to read it over and over. It was definitely the chapter that gave me the most problems, because I don't know a lot about I know some about Marx, but the question you posed at the beginning, like the title itself, Capitalism is Contradictory Value Production, I think it's important for my audience to understand what that is, because you talked about, even from the manager, these so-called managers of the capital, of the production, all the way down to the lowest tier worker, all these elements are a part of the production process. But what do you mean when you say the contradictory value production, capitalism, that is?
So, Marx and Engels understood one thing very clearly, and that was that capitalism is a very distinct, historically distinct form of organization of social production. So it did not exist, or it didn't always exist. Let's say it came into existence somewhere between 300 to 500 years ago, roughly speaking, in one part of the world, and then it sort of was spread to other parts of the world, or was spread to other parts of the world, however you want to put it. But it came into being at this point. And what was different about it, what was most different about it compared to other previous forms of production, was that it did not, all other forms of production produced what is needed. You want food, you want clothing, you want housing, you whatever, you produce those things. But in capitalism, the aim of the production decisions made by those who make the most important production decisions of that system, namely the capitalists, their aim is not the production of shirts or shoes or milk or what have you. It is the production and accumulation of value. Now, what is that value? Now, again, this required an enormous amount of thinking on Marx's part, etc. But that value is essentially a sort of what, as Marx put it, socially necessary labor that is embodied in certain commodities. So imagine that I have this cup. This cup costs, $5 to produce. And it costs $5 to produce because it embodies $5 worth of socially necessary labor. By that, he meant that it was labor that under given conditions, given levels of skill, given levels of technology, given levels of education, given norms about how fast somebody should work, etc., given all these things, that is how long it takes, that $5 worth of labor is how long it takes to produce this. And the mechanisms of competition in this system tend to depress the prices of things towards their value. This is the tendency. There is no guarantee that prices and values will always be equal. Indeed, Marx even says somewhere that in order for the capitalist system to work, the divergence between prices and values is necessary in the system, but we can discuss that later. So the point is, the purpose, when a capitalist lays out money in order to organize the production of anything, he buys the labor, the buildings, the raw materials, the machines, etc. His aim is not to produce cloth or shoes, as I say, or what have you. His aim is to lay out X amount of money, say $100, and end up at the end of a certain period, whether it is a month or a year or whatever, with that $100 back plus an increment. And that is the purpose of value. And by the way, one final point I'll make is that value is expressed in, but is not the same as money. So that's the first point, is that it is value production. And by the way, Marx and Engels in many ways, and I've written a lot about this. If anyone's interested, just write to me and I will send you my writings. But Marx and Engels are, they in some ways, they were following what other classical political economists had done in distinguishing the present, that is to say, capitalist form of production from previous forms. But they were also much more precise in delineating exactly how capitalism was different from previous forms. But there was another thing they were also saying, because in order to produce value in this way, you need to, just because you need to have pure socially necessary labor, you need to remove labor from its normal embedding in a particular piece of land with rights to use it and so on. You have to separate labor from it so that the worker or the laborer, whatever word you want to use, is precipitated separate from his normal, what Marx calls the normal workshop of that he has, which would be the soil. Separated from that, then he has or she has no option but to work for a capitalist who owns the means of production, because they have been separated from the means of production, from the means of consumption, from the means of work, everything. So they can only work for the capitalist in this sense. And because capitalism does this, if you read Marx and Engels carefully, they are very clear that capitalism is not the most natural form of organization, which is what tended to be assumed by a lot of Enlightenment thinkers. You know, feudalism was unnatural. It imposed all sorts of unnatural restrictions on human behavior. And somehow market society capitalism is very natural. But Marx and Engels were very clear that capitalism was the most unnatural form of social organization of production that humanity has had the misfortune to light upon. So, okay, so that's value production. Now, precisely because it's so unnatural, because it is actually deeply contradictory at its roots. It's contradictory for both, you know, I as you see in chapter 2, I have this figure which shows there is the vertical axis of capitalist exploitation, which is the relationship between capitalists and workers. And then there is the horizontal axis of relations among capitalists. So the relations among capitalists is that of competition, and relation between capitalists and workers is that of exploitation. And there are flows of value that take place along both axes. So value flows from the producer to the capitalist, from the worker to the capitalist as exploitation. And then value also flows from the less efficient to the more efficient capitalist in the form of extra profit. So essentially, but these mechanisms, Marx argued, were deeply contradictory. Because, well, they were deeply contradictory in two different senses. One is that, of course, the fact that workers were not paid the full value of what they produced always raised the ever-present possibility that everything that was produced would not necessarily find a market. So the possibility of glut, of overproduction or underconsumption, which to me are more or less the same thing, this was all existed. And then the fact that there was no coordination in the efforts of the producers other than market competition, which meant that essentially the whole system was anarchistic, led to all sorts of other problems in which, say, for example, to take the most famous example, capitalists may invest in order to increase their profits. But the paradoxical result of many capitalists investing at the same time is actually to bring, over the long term, to bring down the rate of profit. So inadvertently, capitalists may themselves think that they are investing in order to increase their profits, but the result of their many collective such decisions is this result. So anyway, the point is that there are already contradictions. They are inherent in value production, both in the form of the production as well as in exchange. And then also you can see them in other spheres, because capitalism may require only production and exchange. But in order for capitalism to exist as production and exchange in the market, in order to realize the value, you have to change a heck of a lot of other things. You have to change the state, you have to change human relations with the environment, you have to change the functions of money and credit and what have you. And along all of these fronts, you see that because capitalism requires these other spheres of life to be structured in a certain way, inevitably, they also become ensnared in the tendency towards crisis. So I've tried to show that there are many different forms of crises that may occur, and probably that table which I created to show how these crises occur, it can be expanded. But anyway, the point is that capitalism is deeply unnatural, it's deeply contradictory, and it ensnares the whole of society and different realms of society into its contradictions. And therefore, it creates multiple fronts of contradiction, so that any given crisis, for example, the one we are in right now, will probably be a combination of a number of different crisis mechanisms that are at work. So that's what I mean by capitalism as contradictory value production. And a lot of people who call themselves Marxists have basically rejected the notion both of value, in the sense of claiming that Marx essentially got whatever he was saying about value wrong, because he could not translate values into prices. So that goes out of the window. And then also the idea of contradiction goes out of the window, because on some of the most important ones, like the two I just mentioned, they say, number one, Marx does not say that capitalism suffers from gluts. Whereas, in fact, I've written a long article in which I show, in the Grundrisse, in volume 1, in volume 2, in volume 3, all the different things that Marx says, which lead, which show that Marx did indeed not only think that this was a big problem, I even quote him as saying this is the most fundamental problem of capitalism. And then they say that, Marx was wrong, that over the long run, profits fall. So there's a whole bunch of problems in this sphere, as a result of which essentially, today's capitalist society benefits from the wonderfully useful circumstance that there are all sorts of Marxists who go around saying that Marx was wrong. What could be more useful than people who are calling themselves Marxists saying Marx was wrong? So you can say, well, look, I haven't read Capital, but here's this guy, he's a Marxist and he says Marx wrong. So why should, what could be more useful, So this is the issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely, and that's why I kind of take things at first as a grain of salt, because I know over the years I've heard people, and I don't really follow specific people who say that they identify with Marxist economics or whatnot, but I just know that, like you said, it seems like some of these people have never read Marx at all, just the way they talk. And I think they also compare the circumstances during his lifetime versus like now. We have the benefit of a lot more information and we can easily, point to certain things, but that doesn't mean that there's not a base already established. I'll tell you what I got from reading your book and also thinking about Marx more is economics to me isn't as scientific as it presents itself to be, because the example you just gave, the $5 with the mug, that would imply that that's the $5 value is understandable, but based on what you said, there seems to be this arbitrary value given to the $5 mug because you have what you said, the outside, the competition, which creates speculation. And so when you create that, where does the price go then? And I also got from the chapter where you said that the worker's never going to be given the full value of what they're actually worth. That how do you actually translate that value to the worker? The worker is actually producing way more value than what the capitalist would suggest. I thought that was interesting. I'm still trying to understand it, but I can definitely see what you're saying is definitely exploitative.
Yeah. And may I just make one small clarification, at this point, because it might help you a lot. It's not that the worker is not paid the full value. I mean, it is true that the worker is not paid the full value of what he produces, but Marx also said something else. The way it works is not that the capitalist is outright cheating the worker, not in one sense anyway. And that is the capitalist buys the labor time of workers. He hires you for the month, for the week, for the day, whatever it may be, for the year. The capitalist hires you at the given rate at which labor is sold. So labor has its own value, and it is created through a multiple of different means, both through the essentially what's called the cost of production of labor. That is to say, what does it cost for a worker to live on an ordinary basis on generally accepted norms, and so on. So imagine that your labor is worth $100 a day. Fine. The capitalist then hires you because he knows that he can pay you $100 a day, but you are capable of working within the day, however long it may be, 8 hours, 10 hours, whatever it may be, 7.5 hours, whatever it is. He only hires you because he knows that in the course of the working day, he will be able to extract more than $100 from your work. And then out of that, he pays you $100. So imagine that you actually end up producing $180 worth of product. But then he pays you $100 and he stands as somebody who gains. Now, I also like to say that if it was not for the fact that human beings everywhere are capable of producing far more than what they need to live, and therefore what the value of their labor is, there wouldn't be any capitalism. Voila. It's as simple as that. I mean, you wouldn't hire somebody and pay them $100 so that they could produce $100 worth of things for you. Not if you were a capitalist, you wouldn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes more sense. That does make more sense. In the same vein, you talk a lot about this relationship between imperialism and capitalism. Now, did I read this right? That you're saying that capitalism isn't inherently imperialistic? Is that true? Like the earliest roots of capitalism?
Oh no, on the contrary, I say that capitalism is inherently imperialist.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because it is inherently contradictory. So because it's inherently contradictory, first of all, I point out that the contradictions of capitalism mean that states have always had to play a major role in stabilizing capitalism, because a system that constantly falls into these crises, if the state is not there to stabilize it, then it would have ended a long time ago, basically. So actually, the role of capitalist states in keeping capitalism going has been very central. So that's the first thing. Now, but then capitalist states essentially intervene in order to stabilize capitalism, which has become destabilized as a result of its own contradictions and its own crises. When states intervene, they can undertake one of two types of actions. One is they can undertake certain types of reforms domestically, right? So, for example, one obvious example of such reforms is that in the post-Second World War period, when governments, of course, they were intervening quite significantly in capitalist countries, in the major capitalist countries. And one of the big ways in which they intervened in capitalist economies was to vastly expand working class consumption, and also therefore the share of the total production that went to the working class. And what this did was it essentially postponed for a long time the inevitable tendency of capitalism to result in class, because working class consumption was expanded, the investment opportunities for capital were great, and capitalism essentially went through the so-called golden age of sustained growth. So that's one example. But capitalists can also, as capitalist states can also try to resolve the contradictions of capitalism through international action, which is to say through imperialist action, in which, for example, you try to solve the problem of excess goods, that is to say gluts, by finding markets abroad. You try to solve the problem of excess capital by finding investment outlets abroad. You try to solve the problem of finding cheap labor and cheap raw materials as inputs by finding external venues from which to get these things. So in all of these ways, the contradictions of capitalism make it imperial. It has always done so, and today as well. That is, it's an inherently contradictory system, and capitalist states are promoting or pursuing the imperial policies in order to help resolve those issues and problems.
Thank you for clarifying that. That makes sense. But I had to slip it in because I'm just like, am I hearing this right? I'm like, okay, that's why I always ask, because I don't want to assume anything.
And by the way, I should say also, just one further clarification. I should say that my position, by insisting that it is the contradictions of capitalism that are the root of imperialism, in maintaining this position, I'm quite different from a lot of Marxists. There's definitely a school of Marxists out there who say that, of course we are against imperialism. It's very bad when it happens, and it's bad and sad and all those things. But they say it's not necessary to capitalism. And those are the people from whom I differ.
Oh, I got you. Just one more explanation within this vein of what we're talking about here with production value and whatnot, before we, I guess, expand it to more, it's not outside the book, but it's more so geopolitically focused. When you say that land, labor, and money are not commodities, what does that mean for the audience?
That's a really fascinating question. And so first of all, let me say that the place where I first read this was, of course, Karl Polanyi's very famous book, The Great Transformation. And Polanyi is also, his critique of capitalism is built on this observation that land, labor, and capital are not commodities, and that treating them as commodities gives rise to all sorts of problems within capitalism, which in the 19th century were resolved partly by society pushing back against capitalism and requiring capitalist states to undertake a number of reforms. For example, certain types of environmental reforms or certain types of labor reforms, and also central banking in the case of money. So, Polanyi was very interesting from that point of view. But in making this observation, many people, and in general, people have argued that, Polanyi is kind of a, if you don't want to be considered a revolutionary Marxist, Polanyi is your go-to guy, because he's considered to be someone who was a social democrat rather than a socialist. He accepted capitalism because of his idea that of this double movement, that, the spread of markets will be counteracted by social action. So somehow, the yo-yo between markets and social action will continue and everything will be hunky-dory. This is actually not true, because Polanyi was very much a socialist. Indeed, the great transformation begins with the sentence that says 19th century civilization has collapsed. And one of the key things he means by it is that the tendency in the 19th century for this yo-yo to occur between markets and social action, this is no longer possible. And because it's no longer possible, so there's no social double movement anymore, because this is no longer possible, we have to build some kind of socialism, because otherwise the only other option is some kind of fascism. So he was very clear about that. But anyway, let me come back to this three. So he's not social democratic is the first point I want to make. He's very much a socialist. The second point I want to make is that when he says that, when he bases his critique of capitalism on the point that land, labor, and money are not commodities, many people read that as saying, oh, well, he's completely anti-Marxist, because for Marx, all these things were commodities. This is actually simply untrue. Think about it. And people, and my own explanation, which I have written in one of my articles about, primarily about Polanyi, but in which I deal with this question of his similarity to Marx. I point out that, if you look at classical political economy, which is different from neoclassical economics, classical political economy right from the beginning knew that, but they never explicitly said so, but they knew that land, labor, and money were not commodities. Why did they know this? Because they had one set of theories about how the value of commodities was determined, and another set of theories about how the value of land, labor, and money was determined. Okay, so because they knew that they were not commodities. Because remember, what is a commodity? A commodity is something that is produced for sale. So they were very aware that, well, babies may be produced, but we don't make babies so that they can go and work for somebody else. Or land is not produced at all. Money also is in fact not produced. It's more like a social institution, a method of organizing society. So in all of these ways, they knew very well, and classical political economy, up to and including Marx, devoted a lot of time and energy to figuring out exactly what were the rules by which the prices of these things, which were not commodities, were determined, and there were special rules in each case. So in that sense, I would say that Marx also knew that land, labor, and money were not commodities. What he did realize, however, is that capitalism, just as Polanyi did, by the way, capitalism requires them to behave like commodities, which then introduces a whole bunch of complications. But there it is, yeah.
Okay, so this is a transition question, but it involves something that we just discussed. I'm curious about the geopolitical economy. If we use China, Russia, and the US, for instance, we have a geopolitical circumstance now that's pretty documented. How do we compare that circumstance that we're in now with the hegemony components to the pre-1971 world, which was the year that the gold standard the gold was not longer tied to the US dollar in 1971. How do we compare the geopolitical circumstance then, pre-71, to now?
I mean, that is an enormous question. And I would say that and my two books, both Geopolitical Economy and the new one, Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, a Geopolitical Economy, these two books are kind of devoted to answering this question. So without rehearsing all of that, let me just maybe talk about a few of the points, that can perhaps help unravel and give people a flavor of the story I tell. That would be the proper answer to the question that you are asking. So let me say, first of all, that the one thing I do is I blow a lot of holes, and I riddle the idea of the gold standard with a lot of holes. So because I point out that the gold standard in its classical form was, of course, the gold sterling standard, which prevailed from the late 19th century till about the early 20th century, of say 1914 as a rough demarcation. This was really, and people think that somehow gold acting as world money somehow made it all work automatically, and that was the essence of it. Actually, first of all, gold, I often argue that it should not be called the gold standard. It should be called the colonial standard. And if I wasn't from India myself, I would say it should be called the India standard or the British India standard. Why? Because essentially, the functioning, yes, of course, gold played a role in the sense that the value of sterling was linked to gold. All right. But in reality, in the operation of the gold standard, gold hardly entered into it. John Maynard Keynes, who wrote this book, Indian Currency and Finance, a book that is to this day regarded as a textbook about how the gold standard worked. Like, if you want to understand it, read that book. So the point here is that, and when in that book, Keynes says that England ran the gold standard with less gold in its possession, that there was less gold in the possession of the Bank of England, which was the institution that ran the whole thing, than there was in the Central Bank of Argentina. Go figure, right? So the point was, it was not based on gold. So then you'll say, well, what was it based on? Well, here lies the really interesting question. It was based on the fact, essentially, the way it worked is that Britain supplied the world with liquidity in the form of sterling, in the form of essentially gold-backed sterling. But it was able to do this in a stable way because it extracted vast surpluses from its colonies. And of course, the biggest of them at this time, by far, was British India. And I use the word British India very carefully. I don't want to equate it to present-day India, because British India included what is present-day Pakistan and Bangladesh as well, and for a time would also have included Burma. So the point is, this was a vast territory. In fact, it was the most populous territory in the world, because with all this, it was even bigger than China. The surplus is extracted from this colony through a variety of means, including, charging India for the privilege of being ruled by the British, by appropriating India's vast export surpluses. People don't realize that during this time, next to the United States, India was the biggest trading nation in the world. And it had enormous export surpluses, which, of course, the British appropriated as their own export surpluses. Anyway, so it appropriates all these surpluses and then it exported them as capital to other parts of the world. Not necessarily what I would call the non-settler colonies like British India or Africa or the Caribbean, but to the settler colonies, Canada, the United States, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and of course, to Europe. So essentially, the British financed the industrialization of these parts of the world, because think about it, that's when the bulk of the industrialization of this part of the world took place as a result of British capital exports from the non-settler colonies to the settler colonies. So, you're talking about racial capitalism. This is a very important element of racial capitalism. Okay, so it worked through these capital exports. That's how the British provided the world with liquidity. That's how the world had lots of pound sterling to do business with. But when it comes to the United States, it had no capital to export. It had no colonies from which to extract such capital. And indeed, it became the leader of the capitalist world at a time when everybody was competing to expand their economies, and the United States could not spare any capital if it was going to keep its economy large in comparison to other countries. So then it began to provide the world with liquidity by running deficits. And this was already problematic. So throughout, by the late 50s, it had become very problematic. This famous Belgian economist, Robert Triffin, said, this method of providing liquidity to the world is inherently problematic because the bigger your deficits, the less valuable your dollars. So there is an inherent contradiction in providing the world with liquidity like this. And indeed, within a few short years of the European recovery, the French and other Europeans said, we don't keep your dollars. We don't want your dollars. We have an export surplus with you, and we want you to pay us with gold. And so this drained gold out of the United States already. And of course, there was the United States overseas military expenditures as well, and so on. So this drain of gold essentially caused a crisis, and as a result of this, in 1971, the dollar's link with gold had to be broken because the dollar could no longer be backed with gold. The US didn't have enough dollars to do that. And then, since then, what has happened is that in order to counteract the downward pressure, which US current account deficits, its military expenditures abroad, its declining trade position, in order to counteract the downward pressure of these things on the US dollar, what the US has done is vastly expand financial activity. So dollar-denominated financial activity, so that in order to essentially participate in this giant casino that the United States and the Federal Reserve has opened, rich people around the world will put money in the dollar-denominated assets, thereby driving up the value of the dollar because more dollars are demanded, etc., etc. And this is how it has worked. This whole thing, I mean, I can go on about it, but I won't. I'm just giving you one idea. So that's really, and so my purpose in this is to actually say that it has never been stable for the currency of one country to serve as the currency of the world, and the world needs a very different solution. So something very similar to what Keynes proposed in 1944 when he proposed to set up an international clearing union, which would administer Bancor, which would be a special currency with which central banks would settle their imbalances with one another. Not, we would all continue using our dollars and our pounds and whatever it may be, rupees and rubles and so on, yuan, etc. And I think something like this should be necessary. But the idea, so that's the first set of things. I'm sorry, and I'll say one other thing before ending right now. But the second thing I argue is that US hegemony was never fully achieved. I mean, first of all, a lot of what passes for theory of US hegemony isn't theory at all. It's simply dressing up US ambitions in theoretical garb. The US had wanted to replace sterling with the dollar a long time ago, beginning at least in the early 20th century, but it never succeeded in doing so for reasons that I've just given. So as a consequence, you have to say that the entire idea of US hegemony, or the claim that the US is hegemonic is certainly wrong, was once hegemonic and then failed is also wrong, quite frankly. I think it's important to see that the United States was trying to do this in a context where it could never have succeeded. So I've talked long enough, so I'll pause here anyway for a bit.
No, your talking is music to the audience. That's why I bring on esteemed guests to give this information that we normally wouldn't be able to obtain in such a concise way, but also get in-depth explanations. No, we appreciate the time that I love listening to these episodes, just in the car when I'm going to bed or anything. So and it is enriching. It feels good knowing that you're getting good information. And it gives people time to sort of think and ponder how we are so connected to the world. That's one of the biggest premises of the forum, is to show, and that honestly, it's a blind spot that I see with a lot of my friends. I've said this in a couple of episodes previously, that you can't be really politically minded unless you understand how the world is connected. Um, you can't see it as just within your zip code, within your state. That's not how it works. If you want to really grow into a politically conscious person, you have to always consider the world and the connection that we have as humans. Um, I was thinking about when you mentioned gold and sort of debunking the whole idea of the gold standard. You called it the more or less a sterling-based standard because
It
the
was called the gold
colonization.
sterling standard, even in
Hmm.
the heyday. Yeah.
That makes and that's an interesting point about how you had the colonial effect with with Great Britain, but the U.S. really didn't have that dynamic. But you have 3 of the 13 member states from OPEC joining the BRICS Plus in January 2024. You have United Arab Emirates, you have Saudi Arabia, and you have Iran joining with Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And the 3 non-OPEC nations that are joining are Argentina, Egypt, and Ethiopia. And there's speculation that there are going to even be more countries down the road. My question is, how do those 3 OPEC nations in particular, I understand the strategic angle of joining BRICS Plus, but how does that have any ramifications on the US dollar going forward?
I would say there are a couple of maybe 3 different things involved. So 2 of them are as follows. So first of all, I would say that we talk a lot about de-dollarization, and I would say that the reason why we do so is because there are two things are simultaneously correct. Number one, the internal contradictions of the dollar system are mounting because like I've said, the acceptance of the US dollar today by the world relies on vast amounts of financialization, and this has meant vast amounts of predatory lending, vast amounts of speculative asset price increases. And today, with the return of inflation, which is itself a manifestation of the US's declining influence in the world, because in the heyday of its influence, the inflation was kept low, not by deft management of the Federal Reserve, but by the US's ability of essentially dampening the possibility or abolishing the possibility of development elsewhere, which meant that demand for primary commodities would not be very high and there would be less inflationary pressure. I mean, there's various reasons, and also its inability to ensure that its old supply chains, which it had established with countries like China in particular, they no longer function. So anyway, so inflation has returned, and with the return of inflation, the Federal Reserve has committed itself to try to solving it only by increasing interest rates. But there it's caught in a bind, because the higher the interest rates go, the more it endangers the financial structures that have been based on a regime of easy money for the last 2 decades. So thanks to that, the contradictions, as I say, of the internal contradictions of the dollar system are mounting. The second thing that is happening at the same time is that alternatives are emerging, alternatives to the dollar, alternatives to SWIFT, alternatives to World Bank and IMF finance. So in all of these ways, the existence of alternatives is kind of pushing the world in a different direction. And then, yes, there is a third thing, which is, essentially, as people know, the dollar's value is inversely proportional to the value of oil and other primary commodities, gold, oil, etc., etc. So the higher the prices of those things go, the more the downward pressure on the dollar as the world's currency. Now, as these countries become less amenable to US pressure to keep down the value of oil, because the higher the value of oil, the lower the value of the dollar. So them escaping the ambit of US influence and persuasion will definitely be very consequential for the dollar system as well, because it will also increase the inflationary pressures, which will increase the squeeze in which the Federal Reserve, as the manager of this whole casino, will be subject. So all of these things will have an effect on, will accelerate the tendency of de-dollarization.
I love when you say casino because it kind of It's not loaded to me. I mean, it makes total sense to me, the whole idea of a casino. I guess I had a bad experience. I remember when I had my first job when I was 16, Radhika, and I was just a clerk at a local Kroger store. And I bought my first car, and this we're talking about in the late 90s. I bought my first car, and it was a used car, but it was still mine. I could see it was my car. And then I ended up putting $2,500 in the stock market. I think this was back in '98 or something. My parents were telling me like, "What do you want to do with your money? You know, you got your first job." And I felt so proud putting my money in the stock market. And then the next thing I know, within a year, it was all gone. And I said to myself, "How does that work? It's supposed to be an investment. You know, everyone said that this is supposed to be an investment, but it just goes away like that, you know." And maybe we had a bad financial advisor. I don't know, but it always left a bad taste in my mouth. But I think from that point on, I started to say to myself, maybe it's more to just simply putting money into something. Maybe the system isn't fair to begin with. And but I definitely believe that there's so much speculation. We've talked about that before, and there's clearly mechanisms in place that are meant to benefit certain people who are already in the market. And but that's all, but it's never presented that way. It's always presented as the common worker, your money's tied to it, it's going to benefit you. You got to be a part of this. But clearly the people who are running the show aren't going to, make it fair for people. I mean, I guess that's the basic premise. And that's what I hear when I hear people say the casino. That's the only thing I can think of, really.
No, I mean, so first of all, let me just say that actually I was not, I shouldn't take credit for the word casino. Susan Strange wrote a very fine work called The Casino Economy or something like that. So she was the one who was the first person to use this metaphor of casino. But there is no doubt that essentially what has happened, particularly after Alan Greenspan became the chairman of the Federal Reserve, is that he essentially created a system in which he permitted speculation to take place. So we, there's actually quite a fun little book called Greenspan's Bubbles, which if anybody's interested, they should read, by a guy called William Fleckenstein. But anyway, the fact of the matter is what has happened in the last 25, 30 years is that essentially the Federal Reserve has backstopped the big financial institutions from losing money through speculation. Not the likes of you and me, not even pension funds. By the way, many pension funds in the United States, which have become highly financialized, have lost a lot of money. And I remember coming across news stories that at least some of them have actually simply been dissolved, and the people who held money in those pension funds don't have their pensions anymore. So there is a whole pecking order to this. So, essentially, when speculation occurs, you and I might put a few bucks in the system and we may win or lose, as the case may be, if we get lucky. But systematically, if you look at the system as a whole, there are two types of players in the speculation. One is the big financial institutions who always get bailed out. So, and then the second is the retail investors like you and me. So basically what happens is that thanks to insider information, thanks to Federal Reserve backstopping, et cetera, the big net worth individuals, the big financial institutions, they gain the most when the market is rising, and they lose the least when it falls. And the opposite is the case with retail investors like you and me. So, and indeed, one of the big problems that is going to have to be faced in the Western world, where since the 1980s, there has been an accelerating trend towards financializing pensions, is they're going to have to fix the pension system. You can't have a pension system that is based on anything other than essentially the present working age generation supporting the present generation that cannot work, whether because it, all the people who cannot work. I mean, that is always the rule. I mean, there are all sorts of people who can't work, those who are too young, those who are too sick, and those who are too old. And in any society, the present working generation has to support all these three types of people. The society cannot function without having all these three types of people. So the point is that, and this idea of financialized pensions has sort of raised this illusory hope that somehow an individual person can ensure comfortable retirement by essentially advancing a claim on the future earnings of future generations, which may, in this case, in many cases, turn out to be entirely fictitious because these earnings no longer exist. So,
to that point, I like in the book, and I do have two more, I guess they're not really burning questions. Maybe they are, who knows, we'll see. But I like the way in the book you talked about the working class, kind of to your point you just made there. You included everybody, people who are unemployed, people who normally wouldn't be considered part of the workforce, but they're part of the working class. That's still the same segment of people who are going to be affected by all these decisions and speculation and whatnot. Now, I never thought about that before because we talked to Jack Rasmus a few days ago about how the government reports things, but a lot of things that are in the statistics don't even reflect, everyone. It only talks about a certain group of people, and even then, they leave out important details about the people who are attached to the labor. You don't have to have a job to not be affected by this entire economy. They have to be factored in some kind of way. And so I like that the working class, I just never really thought about it that way before.
The expression I use is that the working class consists of all who must work for their income, whether they are employed or not, and whether they are paid a wage for their work or not, which would then include a lot of the unpaid work that is typically done by women.
Absolutely. You already documented before we started. I don't know if it was the recorded version or not. I wish we could have recorded the pre-recording before we got on though. But we were thinking about just this turmoil, the Israel bombardment of the Gaza Strip. And I mean, that's what's in the news now. They've almost turned the page on Ukraine, Russia, just at clockwork. We know that these players in the game who are controlling all the communication lines and are trying to convince people of one particular narrative. Something's obviously going wrong with the plan in Ukraine. Just the previous IMF loans, how do they expect people to pay this money back, for instance? We're supposed to be supposedly helping out Ukraine, but we know that the everyday Ukrainian citizens are just getting, their lives are completely being just uprooted right now, and all because of these military endeavors. But I guess what I was getting at is the Russia part of the equation and all the sanctions that have been put on Russia. I guess Dr. Rasmus was saying that the sanctions haven't had the intended effect. What do you think about that? What has been the overall effect of the sanctions against Russia and the countries that Russia does trade with?
Well, what is really interesting is that the Russian economy has proved quite resilient against sanctions. And that is for a number of reasons. One is it's not a tiny economy. It consists of a fairly sophisticated, skilled workforce, considerable manufacturing, etc., etc. The second is that they got very early warning of this. The West first started imposing sanctions on Russia in 2014, and at that time they took the form of agricultural sanctions. So what the Russians did was they essentially focused on improving their domestic agricultural production. One of the other points I've make in both my books on geopolitical economy is that, you don't really get economic development and economic growth without state intervention and industrial policy and so on. So essentially, the Russians increased their capacity to produce food and also, generally speaking, expanded their agricultural sector, including the inputs such as fertilizers, very successfully in the period from 1914 onwards. So that whereas once they had been dependent on imports of food and such like things, they have over this period become major exporters not only of food in the form of grain, etc., but also of fertilizers. So you saw in the earlier this year and last year, there was all this brouhaha about the export of fertilizers and so on and so forth. So the Russians have now got an idea of what you need to do if you want to be resilient against sanctions. And I think they are doing that. So that's the second thing I wanted to say. The third thing I wanted to say is that also Russia has the possibility of trading more and more with China, all to the extent that the Russian economy relies on the import of relatively sophisticated goods and the export of energy. It can replace its former trading partners in Europe or the United States with China. China is capable of producing practically everything that Russia needs in the form of high-tech goods. And China would probably be very happy to have Russian energy. So that deal is going very well. And of course, Russia is also expanding its trade with other countries. There's a fourth point I should make, which is that actually for all the hullabaloo around sanctions and how we are going to punish Russia, actually, on the one hand, imposing sanctions on Russia is easy because unlike China and the West, Russia's economy and Western economies are not quite so deeply intertwined. But still, there are corporations, Western corporations, who do business with Russia. And on my recent trips, I should say, to Russia, because I've been there several times this past year, I've never ceased to be amazed at the number of Western firms that are obviously still operating, whether they are big labels of clothing and whatever footwear and so on, or whether they are banks and other institutions. So actually a lot of Western businesses continue to operate there. Also remember that, gas is still flowing from Russia to Europe via Ukraine, of all places. So in all of these ways, there is a lot of hypocrisy. We will impose the convenience sanctions, but we will not impose the inconvenience sanctions. So there's a whole lot of that going on. And then finally, I will say one final thing, and that is that, if anything, Russia could be doing even better if the Putin government were less tied to liberal policies, shall we say neoliberal policies, and less, shall we say, eager to please some of the big oligarchs who still dominate the Russian economy. Not all of them, but some of them, obviously. And in their interest, for example, the Russian central bank until very recently has pursued a policy of not imposing capital controls. But now, thanks to the downward movement of the value of the ruble, which has become quite bad, finally the government has woken up and has imposed capital controls. And I hope that they will impose capital controls and they will keep them there. Because the fact of the matter is that when you open up your economy to capital flows, when you lift capital controls, the only thing that happens is that the ability of the financial interests based in the US and the UK to suck money out of your economy only grows. Historically, over the last 2 or 3 decades, so much money has been sucked out of Russia and into countries like Britain that, you can actually, if you go to London, you can actually take a bus tour, which will point to all the big mansions that are owned by Russian oligarchs. And the entire bus tour, which presumably lasts a couple of hours, is devoted entirely to showing you the mansions of Russian oligarchs. So you can see how much wealth has gone. There's absolutely no reason to allow this wealth to leave the country. Why shouldn't it be invested in Russia, which needs to expand its productive capacity? So there, yeah. So that's my kind of slightly long-winded answer to your question about Russia and sanctions.
No, it's not long-winded at all. It kind of goes to the point you made at the beginning of the book that shows the breakdown of U.S. hegemony, where clearly these Western countries still have connections with Russia. I think you alluded to Japan, you alluded to some of the continental European countries, how that connection is not going to be broken, but you seem to imply that those nations are even more resistant than they normally would be, which shows a deterioration of the U.S.'s influence on its quote unquote allies.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm, just a day or so ago, I remember seeing, or maybe it was just this morning, I read a newspaper report about how Gerhard Schröder, the former chancellor of Germany, who has been accused of being too pro-Russian, etc., has come out and simply said that, Germany needs Nord Stream. I mean, the fact of the matter is that every so often, everybody thinks that Europe is simply a vassal of the United States, and it's a sign of the US hegemony that Europe is a vassal of the United States. But Europe has, if it's a vassal, it's been a pretty stroppy vassal, in the sense that, back in the 50s, and 60s, de Gaulle said, give us gold, we don't want your valueless dollars. He took France out of the command structures of NATO. And then as soon as the Soviet Union disintegrated, you saw Europe trying to evolve its own independent security policy, which would not tie it to the United States, which would essentially liberate it from vassalage to the United States. And I think Europeans have historically wanted to do this, but there was Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik. There was the attempt to try to create a common security policy of Europe, both in the 1990s and once again in the 2010s. Remember only a few years ago, Macron was calling NATO brain dead, for example, and so on. So there have been all these attempts. And quite frankly, I think that the only course of action that makes sense for Europe, from the point of view of the well-being of its productive economy and its ability to create broad-based prosperity within Europe, is to, in fact, have good relations with Russia, benefit to the extent possible from Russian energy, gas, etc. I mean, I'm not in favor of fossil fuels, but if you're going to use any, then use something that's close to you rather than something that's transported to you from thousands of miles away in the United States. And all of these things. I mean, the fact of the matter is you cannot have a stable and prosperous Europe if you're constantly making an enemy out of Russia. You need a stable security environment. If you move into a new neighborhood, what do you think is going to increase your security more? Making enemies of all your neighbors and then essentially making a fortress out of your house with little cannons pointing out of it, or actually making friends with your neighbors and say, look, we are here to help you, feel free to borrow my lawnmower anytime, etc. That sort of neighborly relations. So the point is that the United States is essentially forcing Europe to have these wrong kind of relations and the wrong kind of security environment. For this, I mean, it's not, I don't even think the US leadership anymore, which is really, it's the quality of US leadership has plumbed abysmally. They don't even have a coherent program. They're just acting at the instigation of the military industrial complex and financial interests and such like things. So they're not really acting in a coherent fashion. They don't have any vision. They're just pushing whatever interest that, really low-level politicians like Joe Biden are paid to push. That's what's happening. And Europe is entangled in all this. And I hope one day that the ordinary people in Europe realize this. And that's why you see all those demonstrations in various European capitals, which say, why are we making war with Russia, et cetera, and so on. And by the way, one final thing I will say about this, which I find deeply ironic, because I often speak publicly about my position on this, and I point out that the West is waging a proxy war against Russia. People think I'm sort of pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian. I'm not anti-Ukrainian. I would say that even most Russians, or the overwhelming majority of Russians, are not anti-Ukrainian. And when President Putin tried to express this historic relationship between Russia and Ukraine, the West deliberately misread it as saying, Russia is questioning Ukraine's right to exist. Russia never wanted to question Ukraine's right to exist. Ukraine exists. Russia wanted to make the Minsk agreements with them, and Russia wanted to essentially have good relations and ensure that the interests of Russian speakers in Ukraine were protected. In fact, it took 8 years of civil war before President Putin even moved to try to protect these Russian speakers who were under so much attack in Donbass. But the point I really want to make is that against this background, what becomes very clear is that it's all those people who are saying we stand for Ukraine, like President Biden was saying just on Thursday once again, repeating all sorts of unsubstantiated claims against Russia. All those people who are saying we stand with Ukraine, they are the ones who have destroyed Ukraine, because Ukraine now is close to destruction. I mean, the fact of the matter is that, we don't know how the war will unfold, but it is very likely. I mean, it will certainly will have shrunken. If, on the other hand, the West had actually pushed, first of all, not engaged in the Maidan coup, tried to keep Ukraine whole, tried to create good relations between Ukraine, Russia, European countries, etc., none of this would have happened. And even further down the road, after Maidan, at least the Minsk agreements were signed. Germany and France facilitated the signing of the Minsk agreements. They wanted to see them implemented. And instead, and President Zelensky was elected to establish better relations with Russia, to implement the Minsk agreements, and to deal with the problem of Ukrainians oligarchs. If the West had supported Zelensky in doing that rather than doing what they are right now, Ukraine would still exist, minus Crimea for sure. But then Ukraine's claim on Crimea was always far more questionable than even its claim on Donbass. So let's just leave that aside. The fact of the matter is that Crimea was added to Ukraine in 1954. In 1991, when the dissolution occurred of the Soviet Union, Crimeans actually voted to say they did not want to be in Ukraine. And after the inclusion of Ukraine in Crimea into Russia more recently, there have actually been referenda that have been overwhelmingly in favor of staying in Ukraine. And so that today, transferring Crimea back to Ukraine will create greater problems than keeping Crimea in Russia.
And to Radhika's point, if you all refer to, we've had several commentators, geopolitical analysts, discuss the book on Flashpoint in Ukraine, which was published in 2014. A lot of the people that I associate with clearly have no idea about the history of this developing situation. And that 2014 book, Flashpoint in Ukraine, how the U.S. drive for hegemony risk World War III, and also Medea Benjamin's latest book with Nicholas Davies on war in Ukraine, explain these Minsk Accords and just the Maidan coup, all this different. It's not just, we're missing a lot when it comes to connecting the dots, because this same deep state media that people just regurgitate the talking points, the CNN lovers, the Fox News lovers, and the MSNBC lovers, or whoever you follow, your favorite talking head on television. All these people were talking about how Ukraine was a backwards country back then, but people just seem to have amnesia, it seems like. But I've tried to ease up on the people a little bit, because I know that they take in so much propaganda, they don't know what's right and what's wrong. And if you say anything against their positions, because they've been somehow legitimized, because that's what people are accustomed to watching, you're all of a sudden you're pro-Putin, you're pro this, you're pro that, pro Hamas, pro just whatever they want to demonize you as, you become the enemy because you're speaking out against the so-called legitimate sources of information and propaganda. But I like it that you refer to Biden as a low-level politician. You're way nicer than I am when it comes to the choice of words. But I want to get in one final question. And I want to say this is going to be an epic episode, said before. I've enjoyed just listening to everything we've discussed. But I had to end on this note and ask you the question about artificial intelligence. Is this a legitimate threat, artificial intelligence? Because reading your book, I guess people who are concerned about artificial intelligence, or it goes back to that idea of production, the question of production. Is that antithetical to the possible transition from capitalism to socialism with the increase of artificial intelligence?
Well, I think there is no doubt that, well, first of all, let me say that artificial intelligence is the hype of our time. It is massively hyped. I mean, the idea that somehow even things like ChatGPT are terribly hyped up and what it can do. So, the fact of the matter is that there is no doubt that our capacity to process information is increasing massively, but it is not going to replace human thinking. What it is going to do is it's going to allow us to process information. And in this process, yes, some of, just as manual jobs are replaced by robotics, so also there will be some jobs lost, particularly in capitalist contexts. And I think that essentially, I would say that in a certain sense, this increase in our capacity to process information underlies, as do a lot of other things, the urgent need to shift from capitalism, which is in any case, as I argue in the book, productively debilitated, highly financialized, highly unequal, incapable of providing for the welfare of ordinary people in every country, including the most advanced capitalist countries such as the United States. In fact, maybe especially in the United States, because it's so financialized over there. So I think that the need to move away from capitalism is very urgent. Why? Because as our capacity to produce without much human effort increases, what we ought to be doing, first of all, is to produce in an ecologically sustainable fashion the things that ordinary people need to live: food, clothing, shelter, education, transport, culture, what have you, all these things. Let's first of all make sure that we produce enough of this in an ecologically sustainable fashion, which the advance of science, technology, including ICT, should make more and more possible. Secondly, once we've done that, I think that the whole point should be to liberate humanity from work in the following sense. If today we all work 40-hour weeks, let's try to move to 30-hour weeks and to 20-hour weeks and so on, because the point of increased ability to produce should be that then we don't need to spend so much time. We can then spend more time developing ourselves, developing our abilities, our knowledge, our artistic capacities, and so on. I think, and developing human relationships, which, by the way, from the onset of capitalism, our ability to develop human relationships has been handicapped in a radical fashion, because we are not allowed to pay attention to one another, and we must pay all the attention to the capitalist desire to accumulate value. So in all of these ways, and to return to AI for the moment, I would say also that what is also becoming very clear is that by harnessing information processing, let's not call it artificial intelligence because it's a completely wrong term, ability to harness information processing in order to be able to plan our economies rationally is greater than ever. We can plan down to the last a kilo of resources we need to extract, and the last down to the minutely, how many pairs of shoes and how many frocks do we need to produce every year. In order so that people will have what they need. This ability is there, and we don't have to subject everything to central planning, but to the extent that we need to plan and move away from the anarchy of capitalist production, which subjects our economies to routine crises. All of these abilities are today massively expanded. So I would say that, let me put it this way, to realize the full potential of information processing technologies, we need to have a socialist society, because then it will in fact be liberatory rather than oppressive, as it promises to be if we remain within a capitalist context, because it will be responsible for many of us losing our jobs, for example. And by the way, not only will many of us lose our jobs, the capitalist companies that will be firing us will then be offering those services which are of a lower quantity and quality to us at a higher price. So all of this is because if you replace, how many of us have been, have hung on to a phone in frustration because you're talking to a chatbot, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, because you replace a worker with a chatbot and you get chatbot level of service. It's not adequate, actually.
Oh yes, that's a great point. And Dr. Desai, I just wanted to give you the final words. Do you have any plugins you want to give? Do you have any final words of encouragement or any final commentary from our audience?
Well, I just like to say that we talked about many different things, and there are many other things in the book which are worth looking at. So let me just mention a couple of them. But first, let me say that this book is available free to anyone. Because the PDF, there's a foundation called Knowledge Unlatched, which has made my book available to anyone who wants it in a PDF form. It is free. If you want a hard copy, then you have to pay. That's how it works. So, if you are happy reading a PDF, it's yours for free. Secondly, I also have lots of a discussion which people may be interested in as to how so many of the solutions that are presented as, we should have universal basic income or modern monetary theory or what have you. I discuss those and I show some of their inadequacies so that, these are all sort of quick fixes that are not going to solve the problems of capitalism, and they're not going to lead us to socialism. Another really interesting, and I also discussed, by the way, how where the existing neoliberal establishment personified by people like Joe Biden is going to lead us, and also where people like Trump will lead us. And those are unfortunately the only two options. So I underline the need to create a left force immediately, now, yesterday, last year, last decade, etc.
Yes.
But we've got to do this, right? And then finally, we didn't really touch on what I say about the coronavirus pandemic and the response.
I know.
So maybe another time we can chat about it, but it is really an important part of the book. The book started as essentially capitalism and coronavirus and capitalism, but then because this war intervened, I was late in submitting it, and the war started. Then I felt that the very problems that I was identifying vis-a-vis coronavirus, the very problems of capitalism I was identifying vis-a-vis coronavirus, were also directly relevant vis-a-vis the war. So I rolled that in and I expanded the scope of the book. So I hope people will read it, and I try to respond to queries I get from readers. So please also let me know if you have any questions.
Yes, and the next time we invite you on, we would definitely focus on the coronavirus aspect of the book. Absolutely. It was definitely intentional to sort of touch on the topics that we did, but we would definitely come back and we will pinpoint that particular aspect of the book, no doubt about it. Beautiful people, a wonderful episode said before. Like I said before, tell your friends and family about Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. Subscribe for free, support independent media, support all of Dr. Desai's endeavors. I'm going to link all of her information, where you can find her publications, her institutions in the episode description. And I just want to say, enjoy the rest of your day, beautiful people, and cheers. Thank you so much again, Dr. Desai, for coming out to Kiko's Freethinkers Forum.
Great pleasure talking to you, Kiko.
Absolutely.